So how can we avoid accumulating that free radical damage? So we know that free radicals are bad. We've got a reasonable idea about where some of them might come from. Some of the main points I'll look at: the impact of calorie restriction, the effect of a high nutrient diet, and the effect of exercise. These are just a few things that are pulled out. Rats fed a calorie-restricted diet with essential nutrients lived up to twice as long as rats fed on a normal diet. Notice that's 1934. That's from Cornell University. Back in 1934, they took two groups of rats. They fed them both the same nutrient type diets, but one had more calories. In other words, they fed them something with a little bit more sugar in it than the other one. The ones that were calorie restricted, they're still healthy, but the ones that were calorie restricted lived up to twice as long as the rats on a normal diet. They had no idea why that happened. What's interesting, this one here, 1992, this is from a Japanese population, 20% reduction in calorie intake, which is not that much, is it? A 20% reduction in calorie intake produced a greater than 40% or around a 40% reduction in death rate for heart disease, stroke, and cancer. Why would reducing calories have that effect? And let me just ask, first of all, do our diets today tend to reduce calories or promote calories? They do. I don't think there'd be too many people who would argue otherwise. Eating less calories significantly reduces free radical production. I'll show you why. Here you've got sugars and fats, and you take that into the body. Now, you mix it with oxygen. And this is one of the main reasons, and pretty much the only reason why you breathe, although oxygen gets used for a couple of other things. You take oxygen in with the fats and sugars, and you've got to make energy out of it. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is actually what the body uses for energy. All right? So it's got to convert the food you eat into energy. And then it produces CO2. What do you do with that? Breathe that out. And water, what do you do with that? Yeah, you excrete that out the other end. That's right. So you've got sugar and fats coupled with oxygen that you breathe with this molecule here. It produces the energy, CO2 and water. And you end up with some body fat. If you've got lots of this, you produce it, you sort of divert it from energy and store it as body fat. We've talked about that. But you also get, when you're young, about 2 to 5% leaks out as this superoxide. Now notice it's O2 dot minus. That dot is an electron on its own. Is that a good thing? Electrons don't like to be on their own, which means that this one has got the potential of doing what? Causing lots of damage. It's a free radical. So that goes up and it starts to do damage, and it can damage particularly the nucleus of the cell. So free radicals can break the DNA. That's what we're really worried about, although it can also damage some of the other machinery. These can all be repaired if the information is kept intact. The trouble is, if it does more damage here, then it can't be. This molecule here, NAD, now I'm going to make an admission here. I've been working on this molecule in terms of the centre of a lot of my research for about the last 10 years. So I like this molecule. It's a very exciting molecule, and you'll see how important it is for a lot of things. But it's really important to assist in the repair of the nucleus. But notice it's also used up here in order for you to make energy. Now, if you're pushing this through, so you're taking lots of carbohydrates and fats, all right, you're going to take more oxygen in, you're going to make more of this molecule, NADH to NAD. So it's using the NAD to make this molecule here. This one here, incidentally, can't be used to repair it. It needs this one. So you're using up this to make this. If you're pushing this through, even if you're only getting 2% each time, and it increases to about 10% as you get older. So the percentage so the efficiency or transfer of electrons tends to decrease as you get older. So when you're young, you might get 2% leakage. When you're old, it's about 10% leakage. So the more you push this through, if you've got a small percent of a small amount, it gives you a small amount of free radical, doesn't it? If you get a small percent of a large amount, you're getting lots more free radical, aren't you? So if you push more of this through, apart from the fact that you might be getting more body fat and therefore stimulating an inflammatory response, which also produces free radicals, you're also producing more of this to get more free radicals. Not only that, but the damage that's occurring here, you've not got as much of this available because it's all being sucked up here to be converted into this. And there's one other small problem, and that is that this one here can also combine with this one here to produce an even more toxic free radical. Look, there's some really bit of complex biochemistry there, but I'm happy to talk to you more about it in detail afterwards. But the point is that the more you've got of this, the more you produce of this, the more damage you have of this, and the less capacity you've got to repair. Does that sound like a positive cycle? It's exactly what you don't want. And yet, that's pretty much how our society is set up, where we have much more calories than what we have nutrients, and so we're actually pushing this through at a great rate. That's just another one, how the archivist knew, well, I won't say that. Laboratory studies consistently demonstrate extended lifespan in animals on calorie restriction where total caloric intake is reduced by 10 to 40%, but adequate nutrition is otherwise maintained. We just finished, in fact, we just had it accepted by the Asia Pacific Journal of Clinical Nutrition on a study that we did on adolescents as well, and basically just showing that when people are dieting, they start dieting and they might stop some calories, but they also stop nutrients as well. And so unfortunately they're setting themselves up for things like osteoporosis and other sort of poor malabsorption syndromes. It's really important that if we reduce calories, we've got to reduce the calories but not the nutrients. So it's a nutrient-rich, calorie-deficient or calorie-low diet. Is that anything new? I mean, you know, that's really nothing new, is it? It's just now that you've got a bit more detail, or at least a bit of background as to why that might be happening. All right, so exercise is the other thing that we need to look at. Exercise increases the body's capacity to neutralize free radicals. So if we have a look at the free radical problem, and free radicals are a problem because they do what? They damage the DNA, don't they? All right? So we've got free radicals, we've got damage to the DNA. What are 3 ways in which we can prevent that damage from being perpetuated? We can reduce the free radicals, we can increase the repair of the DNA, can't we? Or we could also try and quench the free radicals when they were produced. So we can reduce the amount of free radicals, we can try and quench them, that's where antioxidants come in, or we can improve the repair. So those 3 areas are what we've got to target. How does exercise fit into this? Incidentally, exercise increases free radical production significantly. Okay, some of you are going, that's fantastic, that means I don't have to exercise. The thing is, exercise is extremely good for you, and I'll explain why. These are some of the molecules that are used as the body tries to detoxify the free radicals. It uses things like glutathione, catalase, superoxide dismutase. Now, there are these things from the food, which I'll talk about in a minute, but these things here are enzymes that the body uses in order to get rid of the free radicals. So the body's producing them, it knows it, so it's already been designed in order to mop those up. When you exercise, you increase the activity of these enzymes. And the reason for that is this. When you exercise, you're going to produce a lot more energy, don't you? So, you know, you've got to produce that carbohydrate through, so you're going to get an increase of the superoxide produced as a flux, right? So the body has what's called a cellular adaptive response. Because a lot of other things are stimulated during exercise, it says, okay, you're exercising, I'm going to have to produce more of these enzymes in order to repair or be prepared for that extra oxidative stress. So, how many do, oh no, I shouldn't ask. I was going to say an hour exercise a day. However much exercise, if you do an hour of exercise a day, the body is going to be under oxidative stress for that period of time. But it has also stimulated a number of different things, which is really positive, and it has stimulated the production of these things. So that even though you are under some oxidative stress for an hour, for the next 23 hours, you're protected by having a much higher concentration of your antioxidants, which means overall you are far better off. Is that making sense? So that's why this is such a positive thing. Exercise, what does it do? It reduces the stress response. We talked about that before, didn't we? So when you get stressed, what have you got to do? Move. If you move, it resets the stress response. If you reset the stress response, then the body doesn't metabolize so quickly, in which case you're reducing free radical production. Right? So exercise is good there. It also reduces your desire for food because it's already stimulating some other parts of the body, and it actually reduces the amount of There are some parts in the brain called the arcuate nucleus which is particularly switched on and switched off, for feeding behaviour. But it reduces your desire for food. It gives a little endorphin high, so you get that little kick. So when people ask me, why don't I need caffeine in the morning? I go, okay, I exercise. So I get a little high as well. It promotes this, I said mitochondrial activity in fat, muscle and cells. It just increases the capacity to produce energy. Increases the metabolic rate, decreasing the fats that are in the body and also insulin resistance. So it improves the capacity of insulin to work. I know we haven't got a lot of time to talk about the details on that. And it increases the activity of the antioxidant enzymes, which is the last thing I mentioned. This is really a lecture as an overview. So any of those details I'm happy to talk with you afterwards, but exercise is a particularly important thing to do because it is able to basically reduce stress, reduce free radical production and increase antioxidant capacity, as well as give you a little high, make you look good, improve the quality of perfusion through the skin and other organs. So basically it's an all-round good thing to do. All right. Okay, and what about food? How does the body handle the free radicals? Of course, it's still trying to nullify. Eating food with the right nutrients. Now, vitamin A, E, and C are ones that you would all know. But then there are all these other ones, flavonoids, polyphenols. These things are becoming more aware. Who's heard of them? Flavonoids, polyphenols, okay. Probably about a third. These are an extremely exciting group of molecules that seem to have a variety of different positive effects. And eating them in the right combination, that's why the high-coloured fruits and vegetables are particularly good for you. So go for the high-coloured fruits and veggies. I'll make a comment here about meat versus vegetarian. Now, this was actually done by the Vegetarian Interest Group here in Sydney. Two are Adventists, the rest of them aren't. And I won't tell you what the meal was, but it was a particularly generous meal, I think, particularly for the traditional meat meal. But if you looked at these two meals together and you looked at the differences, you can notice that the saturated fat was significantly higher. Omega-3 levels in this particular diet was significantly lower. And omega-3s, that's important for cell membrane function, particularly in the brain, but also in the rest of the body. Omega-3s are metabolized by the same enzyme system that omega-6s are. Our diet has shifted from having a roughly 1-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6, probably at the turn of last century, to around about, and we've just done a series of studies on this, you can have anywhere between 20 to 12-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3 in Australian diets now. So it's hugely in favour of omega-6s, which actually are pro-inflammatory. They produce things like arachidonic acid, etc. Again, you need them, but you don't need them to be out of balance. And they're out of balance with the omega-3s, which are actually anti-inflammatory, so they produce the anti-inflammatory molecules. So it's particularly important to have omega-3s. Cholesterol we all know about. I won't get a chance to mention it later on, but I will just mention it here. Do you realise that you could have a very high cholesterol level and not develop heart disease? Interestingly, I went to a conference just before Christmas last year called Free Radicals in Biology and Medicine. And what was interesting is that one of the researchers got up and he presented this two groups of animals that he had, bred both of them to have very high cholesterols, about 20. Now, your cholesterol should be around about what? Yeah, for certainly less than 5. It used to be less than 5.5, then it went to less than 5.2, now it's less than 5. But ideally, if you can get down there. Now, what's interesting is that you'll still find a number of people who will still develop heart disease even with a cholesterol of around 4. The reason for that, he got these two rats, two groups, both with a cholesterol of about 20. One group, he kept their antioxidant levels very high, so they had virtually no free radical activity or very low free radical activity or oxidative stress. The other group, he increased the oxidative stress levels in a very short period of time, and he took images of it in the carotid artery, etc. And we were able to see the atherosclerotic plaque developing even after a few months in the animals which had the high oxidative stress. Both had the same cholesterol, around 20, remembering, of course, that the recommendation is much lower, around 20, but only one developed the atherosclerotic, the one that actually had the oxidative stress. Now, there is well-characterised reasons for that, which I won't go into this afternoon, but you need oxidative stress in order for you to damage the bad cholesterol, which then deposits on the cell, on the vessel wall, which then creates that cascade which develops that atherosclerotic plaque. So the interesting thing here is that, at least on the veggie meal, your cholesterol is significantly lower. And lowering cholesterol works because it reduces the amount of lipid that's available for free radical activity. But free radicals are a little bit more fundamental, so if you can reduce free radicals, you're actually on the money. All right, fibre is significantly higher in the veggie meal, and now these polyphenols are significantly large amounts in the veggie meal, but almost non-existent in a traditional meat meal. Research indicates that polyphenols may have antioxidant characteristics with potential health benefits and may reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease and cancer. What's interesting, I said, is even in our own researches we've shown that these polyphenols are not just acting as antioxidants. They are acting in some other ways. It's very, very exciting. Sure.
When that diet was set up, the meat diet side, I mean, did it have all the same vegetables?
Yes, it did.
As the other side?
I'm sorry that I didn't bring it in, actually, because...
I'd like to, you've got to look at the true picture.
Yes.
And you talk about omega-3s being low in meat, and yet people who eat fish and who eat, the fresh vegetables or they cook them properly and they have proper salad foods and blah, blah, blah. How can you
Yeah.
compare the two?
Yeah, these two diets, and I am sorry I didn't bring them because when I do read them out, people will go, oh, that's extremely fair, because they really have been very balanced. The amount of fruit and that sort of stuff that was tucked into both of them, the salads that were produced for both of them. And I am sorry that I didn't bring that, and I can't recall all the details specifically, but they are very balanced. The key thing with it is that you still end up, because you're not having a complete veggie source, you still end up with, certainly with these things, because this comes from, and it is traditional meat, so it is actually not so much the white meats, but it is the red meats that were used as a comparison.
And how much was it? You talk about grams.
Well, I haven't got that there, and this has certainly encouraged me for next time to make sure that I do bring it with me. This is the third time I've used this one, and I did it the first time, didn't bring it the second time, and now I've been caught out on the third one. But you're right, I will bring that with me. But it is, and it wasn't a high amount of meat either. I'm not sure what the grams were, so my apologies for not bringing that. That's a good point. If you can trust me, it is balanced. I can certainly send you the details if you're interested, but I know that this is for the general audience as well. So my apologies for that. Just one other comment here, particularly with the flavonoids. There is a lot of different types of flavonoids. So there's a lot of different molecules themselves which will act as antioxidants or have some other beneficial effects. The important thing is to make sure that you get some of them. So having, as I said, the nice coloured fruits and veggies, which is great, berries, cherries, red grapes. Now, a lot of people will go for things like chocolates, cocoa. In fact, I have a friend of mine who wrote a book about chocolate saying that it was good for you. And I think, look, and there is a lot of people who buy that book. I don't know how much money he's made out of it, but maybe a lot. But there is no doubt that there are some positive things within the cocoa. What is the concern more is the fat and sugar that comes along with it. So if you can get it without that, then I would say just absolutely go for it. But you can see it's there in citrus fruits. You've got onions, apples, broccoli, cranberry. I mean, all the things that you know and would say are healthy to have, they're the things to have. And we know that they're producing a lot of these polyphenols, these molecules which are doing some very interesting things. All right, so what else can we do to live longer, healthier lives and slow down the aging process? Exercise and eat more nutrient-rich foods. So the first one was to do what? The first one was to eat less calories. If you go less calories, so you can eat less and then eat more. So it's not about the amount so much, but it's basically saying less calories and more nutrient-rich foods and exercise. not necessarily at the same time. Exercise should probably come after you've eaten. But in any case, so if we want to summarise these, if we want to enhance ageing, we can make sure that we get lots of pollutants and chemical sprays, we can spend a lot of time in the sun, we can increase our cell metabolism by having high energy rich foods, and we can increase our immune activity by various means. And of course maintain a certain high level of anxiety. If we want to anti-age, behavioural strategies, we can reduce exposure, exercise, for most of these get plenty of sleep, and I think this one is particularly important, faith. What does 1 Peter 5:7 say? For he careth for you. And it is extremely important. I mean, there are things in my life, as well as I'm sure there are in yours, that you don't understand, which will cause you stress. But this to me, and I know that I have a very, not only loving, but a very intelligent God who's able to make the right directions for me. But increasing our veggie foods in terms of our food strategy and making sure we reduce the high energy foods. And I would strongly suggest reducing, if not eliminating altogether, which is my recommendation, the caffeine intake. So this is really just reiterating the same thing. Decrease exposure to harmful free radicals, increase the body's ability to neutralise the free radicals through exercise and eating the right foods, and increase the body's capacity to repair the DNA through high nutrient value foods. I just wanted to compare these two and just see, this is the 8 laws of health. How does that fit in? Pure air is particularly important. We've talked about problems with the lungs. We've talked about problems with pollution. It makes good sense to have air which, as far as possible, we're in an environment which is as clean as possible, because we will reduce a lot of those chemical pollutants which we may get from there. In addition to that, you hear about people like breathing properly. Breathing actually is a very important thing. As I mentioned before, you breathe because of what? What's the body trying to do? Well, you breathe because you're trying to produce energy. That's what it uses the oxygen for mostly, is actually to convert to make energy. And if that is not being perfused through all of the tissue, you can get certain tissues which are themselves without enough oxygen and therefore a bit anoxic. So it is important to have good breathing, and exercise improves the ability of the blood to get around all the body and therefore air moving. Now sunlight is a particularly important one, both to get the right amount of and also not to get too much of, so sunlight in balance. And almost everybody I talk to now has ended up with, particularly if they've had their vitamin D done, have a low vitamin D. I'm still not entirely convinced that that's as bad as what we think, although I was speaking to a researcher in this area at University of Sydney, and she was saying that it is, you know, we do still have a problem with the amount of vitamin D exposure that we have here in Australia in the last decade or so. So we probably do need to get a bit more, and when I think about it, many of us probably get up before the sun rises, we hop into the car, we drive to work, you know, essentially before the sun's too high. We sit in an office all day, still not going outside, till almost the sun goes down. We hop in the car, go home, and we've almost not stepped outside at all. And then we try and get it all on the weekend, and so we, you know, get too much sun and, you know, cause ourselves skin cancer. So yeah, not so much in that, and it's not so much with the iron. There is, for some people, a low conversion rate, and there is a potential then, because vitamin D plays a role in calcium absorption and that sort of stuff, so you can end up with a problem there. Most of the problem for most of the population is going to be as a result of reduced exposure, both because of lifestyle, getting there and that sort of stuff, as I mentioned, but also because we tend to cover up a little bit more as well, which is positive. But in the early morning, still between, say, 9 and 11 is still a good idea to have a little bit of exposure if you can. This abstemiousness, no tobacco, coffee, tea or alcohol, I hope, and certainly with the heritage of this church and with your new pastor, I'm sure that there are enough people to explain the reasons why it is a good idea not to go down that track. Because it really, none of them are going to produce anything positive, certainly in the long term. Rest, we talked about that, an important thing in order for us to particularly improve the way the immune system works, but it has multiple functions, and certainly psychologically. Exercise we've talked about, proper diet we've talked about. Use of water, I really wish that we had more of the water treatments available to us now. As I said, I'm a surfer. I love to get into the water, and I think that there are considerable therapeutic advantages. I'm certainly not an expert in that area, but I do think that there are considerable advantages of being able to use good water. The still water? In what way? Oh, the distilled water. Ah, okay. Yes, I mean, distilled water, I think, and this is going to come into questions of whether or not fluoridation, chloridation and that sort of stuff is positive. There's no question that in order to purify the water that we drink as a community, it needs to be well chlorinated in order to reduce bacterial, amoebic infections, etc. from occurring. It's probably no better to, I mean, I don't think drinking chlorine is a particularly great thing. I mean, it is necessary for municipal supply.
When you finish the operation, there's a machine that takes a few liters of water, and at the end of the process, 4 hours later, give you 4 liters. What remains on the bottom, that's really interesting, is the color is brown, thick brown. It's a deep brown color, and it's a film considerable thick, and you have to remove lemon juice and water, and then you have to clean the container, you can use again.
Yeah,
That is incredible.
yeah, there's a variety of, yeah, there are a variety of salts and other things that are in water. So, yeah, I mean, look, I think as pure a water as possible is a positive thing. Look, it's an area that I've certainly, yeah, and it does, and I've discussed with people this sort of thing. Being brought up in Queensland where fluoridation wasn't there, and they were very strong advocates against it, I guess that's my heritage. I don't see any reason to change it, although I know Queensland has just recently, under its new Premier, I believe that they're taking fluoride into the water now. There is good evidence that fluoride will cause a change in the enamel which is resistant to bacteria. However, fluoride itself is a halogen. It's a very reactive molecule. I would still have concerns about that going into the body in large concentrations. And I think if you have a good diet which doesn't have high levels of sugar and that sort of stuff in it, then and good oral hygiene, then the dental caries shouldn't be a problem, and therefore having to cross-link your teeth for things like fluoride is not something that's necessary. So on balance, I think if you've got a healthy diet, then I wouldn't think that fluoride is going to contribute significantly to it. Yeah. 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 The salt certainly, for all of us, if we have high enough amounts, will increase the blood volume as a necessity, as it tries to dilute out the salt concentration. Salt is sodium chloride. The major electrolytes that are in the blood plasma, you've got sodium as an extracellular molecule, you've got potassium as intracellular, and then you've got chloride, which is also extracellular. And these are used by the body to regulate fluid volume within the body. So it is extremely important to the body to keep those within certain levels, fairly tight levels. Having too much salt is going to put pressure on the kidneys and on the vasculature, on your blood system, and you will end up with a higher volume. So I don't think a high salt diet is good for you. But at the same time, a salt-free diet would also be detrimental to health. So, you know, it's pretty much typical of anything. I can give you too much water and you will die. I can give you too less water and, of course, you'll also die. So you need to be balanced still. Yeah, look, and different filters will be able to remove certain things from it. If the highly polished waters, sometimes you've got to be a little bit careful because they can end up a little bit more acidic than others, which will cause leaching of calcium from the teeth and that type of thing. But generally speaking, I think a good home filter, I think is personally, I think is a good investment. We have one, we use it, and we particularly looked for one which would take out as many of the halogens as we possibly could. Okay. That's right. That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's a, you know, it is anecdotal. It's a good story, and I think these are the sort of things which it doesn't surprise me. The body runs better when it's being given what it's intended to run off. So thank you for that story. Mm. Yeah.
I'm not in favour of it because I don't think it's a well-balanced diet.
There's an interesting vegetarian and vegan, like any diet. I think you can be a healthy lacto-ovo-vegetarian, you can be a healthy vegan, you can be a healthy person on something with a meat supplemented diet as well. The best diet, I think, is still one which is certainly vegetable rich. If you have a look at the two, vegan versus vegetarian, there are some concerns with the vegan diet. If people take it in a balanced way, and probably my diet is more vegan than not. I don't have very much dairy at all. I have soy instead, but we eat eggs still. And one of the problems with lacto-ovo particularly is the milk and the potential for milk being pro-allergenic and various other things, and there is some considerable work to suggest that it can affect the immune system. Vegan still has a risk of certainly B12 deficiency. There can be a risk of not getting enough calcium, but then again, this is an unbalanced vegan diet. I think provided you're conscious of what you're doing and provided it's a balanced diet, then I think either of them is going to produce a good result. I think it probably is wrong to try and force everybody to go down one track because it can be more difficult for some families. I gave this talk once a couple of weeks ago, as I mentioned, and one of the mothers at the back said, you know, whenever I go and try and buy sort of healthy things, particularly with a lot of the nuts and stuff like that, you know, they're so expensive. And there's no question, they are expensive. The beans and legumes will be less so, and there are different sources for it. But I do think we have to be a little bit careful. And just going back to Ellen White with this, my understanding of a lot of her advice on this area was certainly a very balanced one, and she was saying we shouldn't be pushing it any particular diet on people per se, although she was very strong on no meat. But yeah. Look, you are correct. She did certainly start off, and then she chose, when she had the health message, she was actually forced herself not to have any. It was very difficult for her for a long period of time. So she never actually put it on the table. What she did, and she certainly advocated against meat, she did do that very strongly. But what she did say, which was interesting and I've used in some talks, is that she said that she would prefer to have people eat meat than actually have high sugar and high milk together, which we tend to have more of. And I think we've got to be very careful with some of those. It's one of the studies I would still like to do, because I think that you'll produce a significant amount of free radical activity as a result of having a diet like that.
And most of the people who are vegans or you know, really sensitive to vegetarianism actually have a high sugar diet.
It can,
Actually incorporate that part of their diet.
yeah, it can be that way. You know, I don't want to pull people down, and certainly I think my wife and I, certainly if she was here, she would support this as well, that we have not strictly gone vegan. As I mentioned, we will still have eggs, but there aren't a lot of good advocates for a radical vegan diet when you see it, because many of them look unhealthy. But what is interesting, and there are some statistics from this again from the US, in relation to cancer particularly, a lacto-ovo vegetarian had a 22% reduced risk of dying of cancer compared to the general population. In this particular... No, it doesn't mean it won't happen. They had a 22%... Yeah, that's true. But a 22% reduced risk of dying of cancer. And there are, of course, a lot of factors that go into ultimately whether we do or not. But a 22% reduced risk is pretty good. The vegan population actually had a 17% increased risk of dying of cancer, which is interesting, which means that there was a 39% difference between the lacto-ovo vegetarian and the vegan. And I would suggest that, and it's interesting that there's an article that came out that I was asked to write just for Science magazine just recently. We were actually looking at both of those. And it's interesting that the problem is probably around a decrease in B12. B12 is necessary in order to keep the, particularly for replication of the nucleus. And so it's possible that that may be related to why cancer was more prevalent amongst that group. But it is something that you need to be aware of. And the B12 issue is something that I think we probably haven't done very well as a community, because it is significant. Yeah, they do. Traditionally, that is true. However, when they're talking about the clinical levels, or the normal range, or the range which is clinically significant, there's been a couple of studies that have been done looking at purely what clinical manifestations of B12 deficiency are, and showing that you need to be above this certain level, and the minimum I think is around about 220, but 250 is probably more likely. And so, provided you're above those, then it really doesn't matter what the rest of the population is, if they're up at 700, provided you're above what is going to prevent you from developing a clinical manifestation of a B12 deficient diet. And I think that's the key thing. For B12? Yeah, if you're a vegan, then you really do need to take either a supplement or make sure that you have B12 fortified foods. And some of the B12 fortifieds are some of the soy milks, if you check them. Yeah, So Good certainly has some. And a colleague of mine actually did some research looking at B12 and actually found that it was better than injections. So it is particularly efficiently absorbed from there. But if you're a lacto-ovo vegetarian, you will get it from milk. As I say, you might be like me, and I'm just a an ovo-vegetarian, in which case I do get it from eggs. But also, you know, I take a Berocca in the morning. I'm probably imbalanced in the amount of hours I spend working, so you know, added to, yeah. B12 in it, yes, yeah.
It's a bit personal because when you go to discuss with the doctor says, well, the solution is to get a couple of pieces of meat a week or whatever. I say, well, all right, but if you have a horse, you give a horse 3 eggs fried and a glass of beer, you will have a very sick animal. The horse is a very strong animal. Maybe the analogy is to absorb that you give a bucket of barley and that horse will work all the day through. I mean, for my problem, is not a solution. The solution is to find a combination within the spectrum that we have in vegetables.
Yeah.
And then you will have the right solution.
Okay, can I just make a comment about B12? B12 is only produced by bacteria. So you don't get it in vegetables. Animals don't produce it either. They are only produced by bacteria. The reason why cows and horses and sheep and all of that sort of stuff they get their B12 actually by bacteria that live in their gut. Now, there was some research that was done quite a while ago which showed that humans actually do have bacteria in the upper part of the gastrointestinal, their mouth, and also in the upper gut, which actually does produce B12. The thing is, it wasn't producing enough. And I'm not sure who I mentioned it to. I might have mentioned it to you earlier. Well, I'm not sure. Anyway, it is one of the studies that I would like to do because I think it's possible that with the environment that we live in, all of us, no matter how strict we are about our food, we will still be eating packaged food which requires certain preservatives and that sort of stuff. And we're getting that all of the time. A preservative really is an antibacterial. And so it wouldn't surprise me, and I don't have the details or the evidence to show this yet, it's a theory. It wouldn't surprise me if we were actually with those preservatives, which should be killing bacteria, are actually killing the bacteria that might be producing more B12, which we would normally have. In which case, in a Western environment, we would need to supplement. If you were a vegetarian, and there are plenty of vegans in places like India, Thailand, etc., wherever you've got Buddhists, strict Buddhists or Hindus, which will be on a vegan diet, and essentially they don't seem, at least as far as we know, seem to have an issue with B12. I would still like to study one of those groups and see whether or not the bacteria is doing as we suggest. But to me, that would be probably the closest to an explanation as to why we're not having the B12 in the diet the B12 that we probably should be getting in the diet. So supplementation is important. And it is an issue, it is something that I think we need to be very conscious of because there are a number of deficiencies, people who are deficient within our community. The Hindu? Depending. It really just depends. There are some who even... Yeah, and look, there are diets, and the diets do change too, depending on the different groups. We're actually doing a study at the moment on the Dalai Lama's monastery in northern India, and I was surprised to find that they do eat a little bit of meat, although I'm being told that they've gone vegetarian in the last 2 years. But so there are variations, but I'm also aware of populations who are themselves very strict, where again this doesn't seem to be a problem. Yeah, 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 and a lot less preservative, if any, and I do think that potentially a problem. I've just seen Jamil waving at me, and I'm not sure what it is. Thanks, Jamil. We're pretty much at the end. Just one last question.
How do you come from a family that had meat and fruit and veggies water, green, yellow, vibrations, and a very low sugar diet? Then I don't think you were going to church only 15 years ago. My doctor suggested at the time, not a good idea to abruptly change your
Mm-hmm.
diet. Now we've got a lot of new people coming into our church, and that is a question to me that I think is important to know the answer to. What is your opinion about an abrupt change in diet and having it be the same issue?
Yeah. I'll answer that in two ways. One is that people who do change their diet abruptly, if they can, certainly seem to benefit from it. There are people who will take much longer in order to change their diet, and some people, their gastrointestinal system just doesn't seem to be able to cope with it very well. And so a moderate change over time is entirely appropriate. And in fact, it's interesting, again, I find Ellen White particularly balanced, and she suggests that this is actually the right way of doing it, rather than advocating necessarily for everybody for an abrupt change. So I think, again, taking it on balance. I think the key thing for us, and Jamil touched on it, and that is that as long as we're focused in the right direction. See, I'm not going to come around to your house and tell you, gee, your diet's not looking really good here. If you ask me something, I'm happy to tell you. But I'll have a certain perspective too, and I hope I've given you an overview, which is something that you can take away and apply yourselves. But we're not in the business of policing. We're not the police. We are the advocates, so we should put it into practice as far as we can. Ask for help, as Jamil was suggesting, and particularly asking for guidance. And I think that with the Holy Spirit moving us in the right direction, if we're all focused in the right direction, some of us have a lot longer to walk than others in terms of getting to the same place. But I think that's the right way of going. But continually anyway, at least being positive as to where we're going. And we all want to be healthy, I think. And I think that's certainly the direction we should be heading in. But logically, for each individual, it will be different how that's applied.